I'm Ed Friedman, and I chair Friends of Merrymeeting Bay. And we are right now on the southwest corner of Abagadasset Point in Bodenham, looking across what I call the middle part of the bay. I consider the bay more in three parts: Thorn Head in North Bath up to the Chops. The lower part being Lower Bay, from the Chops up to Abagadasset Point, which is down to the east here from us. And then from Abbey Point up to the north end of Swan Island, this being upper part of the bay. It's a fantastic spot, unique in the whole world. It's a place where 6 rivers come together. Closest to us, the Abagadasset River. In Bodenham, also the Cadance River. In Topsham, the Muddy River. At the bottom of Swan Island is the Eastern River coming out of Pittston and Dresden. And then the 2 big rivers, the Androscoggin River, and it's the Kennebec River behind us, coming down out of Moosehead Lake in northern Maine and flowing through the Chops. That's called, that gap over there, about 200-meter bedrock slot. Those 6 rivers, the bay is draining almost 40% of Maine, all the water in Maine, through that little slot behind me.
The Gulf of Maine is a very important body of water for the world, not just for all the fish that are here, but the fact that the Gulf Stream goes up through here. It helps regulate the temperature of the earth, and everything that is an input into the Gulf of Maine is deeply important. And the Gulf of Maine is one of the biggest fisheries in the world that people have been coming to for thousands of years. This is the Abagadasset River, one of the 6 rivers that flows into the bay. These smaller rivers are really, really important smaller feeders because it helps to keep the circulation going in this kind of bathtub-like bay, which is also nursery habitat for all the anadromous fish species.
Anadromous fish spends most of their life in the salt water, come up into fresh water to spawn. And that would be most of our species: striped bass, Atlantic salmon, short-nosed sturgeon, Atlantic sturgeon, tomcod, alewives, blueback herring, American shad, rainbow smelt, sea lamprey. Those are probably most of them. And then we have one catadromous species that is born at sea and spends most of its life in the river, and that's the American eel. And so they all utilize the bay and the rivers and work their way up some of these rivers to the extent that they can.
And because of that, it's just part of the network of just all of the biodiversity and all of the species that surround the bay, and then beyond that too. So we have a lot of eagles here, a lot of osprey, herons, a lot of different birds that are deeply important to the ecosystem, but also just absolutely beautiful to watch. And that is a huge part of being here, is just being able to live within this incredible space. And I think probably all the animals feel that way too.
A couple things that make this really unique. This is freshwater but tidal. Biologically, it's considered tidal riverine. And what happens at low tide, all that river water from Maine is going out through that slot behind me, 17 miles to the ocean down at Popham Beach. At high tide, 17 miles for that salt water to come up, but the fresh water is still trying to get out. So it's really the fresh water backing up against the incoming salt that makes the tides in here. So very, very little salt gets into the bay. Technically, we're an estuary because there's a little bit of salt, but geologically, this is really cool. With all these rivers coming in, and they have their flow, typical river flow down, they get into this essentially big pond, and that flow slows down and the sediment drops out. So we are also an inland delta. And while there are a couple of other spots in the world where rivers, major rivers, come to a confluence, like here, the estuaries are a little more linear in nature, so they kind of come together and go right out. The Chops really constrains all of these rivers here. It's really hard to get out of the bay if you're water. And even if you get out through the Chops, the odds are in the next tide cycle you'll be back. And that has real important implications for what goes into the water.
As a contributor to what happens on the bay, we all have to be very mindful about what we put into it, just as if we were putting it into our own bodies. So we want to be careful to keep things like mercury and pesticides and other toxics from going into this water, which then comes up the food chain and throughout the entirety of our environmental health. And to be thoughtful every time we think about what we're doing in our lives that will go down the drain and end up here, and this here impacts everywhere else.
I'm Steve Cohen. I work at the Maine Maritime Museum. I'm a crew member on the Merrymeeting vessel. I think the bay is wonderful. It's nice and clean. It's a good place to go. It's a good place to fish. It's a good place to hang around. There's a lot of protection in there now with where the government has put acts in place, Clean Water Act, protection for the wildlife, and nature is putting it back to where it was.
There are some places that are maybe better not so heavily trodden, and this is a sensitive area, and we don't want to go back to the pollution that we had before. So when people come to visit, I hope they see this beautiful place, and I hope they're also very sensitive to that.